The mountain air at 10,000 feet is thin, freezing, and reeks of high-octane gasoline. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, David Tex Hill peers through a scratched plexiglass canopy. Below him, the Salween River looks like a muddy, jagged crack in the earth. It's May 1942, and the world may as well be ending. The Japanese 56th Division, thousands of soldiers, trucks, and tanks, is snaking its way along a precarious road carved directly into the face of a cliff. They're heading for a bridge. If they cross it, China falls. Tex Hill adjusts his goggles, kicks his rudder, and pushes his stick forward. The nose of his plane, painted with the jagged white teeth of a great white shark, tips toward the abyss. The scream of the engine fills the canyon as he enters a terminal dive. He isn't a soldier of the United States. Technically, he's a civilian employee of a front company, an outlaw pilot in a forgotten theater of war. And today, the fate of a nation depends on whether or not he can hit a target no larger than a backyard garden from 2 miles up. Welcome to World War II Obscura. In the early months of 1942, the news for the Allied powers was a relentless drumbeat of disaster. Pearl Harbor was a smoking ruin. The Philippines had fallen. The Gibraltar of the East, Singapore, had surrendered. But in the skies over China, a small group of Americans were doing the impossible. They were winning. They were the American Volunteer Group, or AVG, better known to history as the Flying Tigers. But the name Flying Tigers suggests a polished official unit. The reality was far stranger. These were men who had resigned their commissions in the U.S. Navy, Army, and Marine Corps to go to a war that didn't officially exist. They were led by Claire Chennault, a man the U.S. Army Air Corps had tried to force into retirement because of his radical theories on air combat. Chennault was labeled a crank who believed that the traditional way of fighting, the elegant one-on-one dogfight, was dead. In China, he found a patron in Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and a playground for his theories. What Chennault built wasn't just a squadron, it was a private air force, staffed by men who were paid in cash and bonuses for every Japanese plane they shot down. They were buccaneers in the age of industrial war. Today, we're looking at their most spectacular and desperate hour, the moment these outlaws saved the world's most populous nation from total conquest. The story begins not in the air, but in the darkened offices of Washington and San Francisco in early 1941. The United States was not yet at war, but the Roosevelt administration knew that if China collapsed, the Japanese would become unstoppable in Asia. The solution was a legal fiction called the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, or CAMCO. Under this cover, recruiters visited American air bases looking for adventurous pilots. The pitch was simple. Resign your commission, sign a 1-year contract with CAMCO, and go to China to protect the aircraft factories. The pay was $600 a month for a wingman, nearly triple what an Army pilot made, and a rumored $500 bonus for every confirmation of a destroyed enemy plane. These men boarded Dutch silver liners and headed for the Far East under false passports, listing their occupations as bankers, clerks, or musicians. They were a motley crew. Some were elite flyers, others were washouts looking for a second chance, and many were just young men who wanted to see the fight before the world burned down. When they arrived in the British colony of Burma, they were met by the old man himself, Claire Chennault. The training ground was Tungu, a remote airfield in the Burmese jungle. It was a hellscape of heat, malaria, and mud. The barracks were primitive huts with thatched roofs, and the humidity was so thick it seemed to clog the carburetors of their P-40 Tomahawks. Chennault didn't care about their discomfort. He cared about their tactics. He stood before them, a weathered man with skin like old leather, and told them everything they knew about flying was wrong. The Japanese fly the Zero and the Oscar, he told them. They can outturn you, outclimb you, and outmaneuver you. If you try to dogfight them, you will die. He taught them dive and zoom, use the P-40's superior weight and speed, dive from the sun, fire single devastating bursts from your 50 caliber machine guns and keep going. Never turn, never look back. It was a cold, calculated way of killing that stripped the romance out of the air. Some of the pilots hated it. Some quit, but those who stayed became the most lethal unit in the world. As 1941 drew to a close, the AVG was finally ready. They had painted their planes with the iconic shark's teeth, an idea they actually borrowed from a magazine photo of a British squadron in North Africa, but they made it their own. On December 20th, just days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, sharks got their first taste of blood. 10 Japanese bombers were spotted headed for Kunming, the gateway to the Burma Road. The AVG scrambled. The pilots felt the violent kick of the P-40's Allison engine as they roared off the dirt strip. When they sighted the bombers, they didn't circle for position. Following Chennault's orders, they dove from 20,000 feet like falling anvils. Japanese bombers, which had been operating with near impunity over China for years, were suddenly torn apart by heavy machine gun fire. In minutes, 9 of the 10 bombers were spiraling into the mountains. The AVG had lost nothing. The legend of the Flying Tigers was born, but their greatest test was yet to come. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese were no longer just bombing, they were invading. They smashed through the British defenses in Burma with terrifying speed. Rangoon fell. The Burma Road, the only supply line keeping China alive, was severed. The AVG was forced to retreat, leapfrogging from one jungle airstrip to another as the Japanese army nipped at their heels. The conditions were appalling. Ground crew worked in the dark to avoid air raids. The pilots were exhausted, many suffering from dysentery and fever. The Japanese 56th Division, known as the Dragon Division, was leading the charge. They weren't just taking Burma, they were pushing north toward the Salween River. The Salween is one of the most formidable barriers on Earth, flowing through a gorge that is in some places deeper than the Grand Canyon. On the other side of that gorge lay the road to Kunming. If the Japanese crossed the Salween River, the war in China was effectively over. In early May, the Chinese army blew the bridge across the Salween just as the Japanese vanguard arrived. But the Dragon Division didn't stop. They began assembling a pontoon bridge under the cover of the morning mist. On the western bank, thousands of Japanese vehicles, trucks, tanks, and mobile artillery were backed up for miles along a narrow road that had been blasted out of the cliffside. They were a sitting duck, but only if someone could get to them. Chennault received the intelligence and knew that this was the moment. He summoned his best flyers. "We've got to go stop them at the river," he told them. "If they get across, we're done." On May 7th, 4 P-40s led by Tex Hill and Ed Rector took off from Baoshan. Each plane was carrying a 500-pound bomb, an improvised modification for a fighter that wasn't designed as a bomber. They arrived over the gorge and saw a sight that was both terrifying and magnificent. The Japanese column was trapped in the bottleneck of the canyon. The road was so narrow that the vehicles couldn't turn around or pull off. Tex Hill rolled his plane into a dive. He could see the Japanese soldiers leaping from their trucks, scattering for cover that didn't exist. He released his bomb. It struck the cliffside just above the lead trucks, triggering a massive landslide of rock and earth that buried the head of the column. Rector followed, dropping his bomb at the rear of the column. In seconds, the Japanese 56th Division was trapped in a 3-mile-long kill zone. The 4 P-40s then began strafing runs. They flew back and forth along the canyon walls, their 650 caliber machine guns stitching a line of fire through the trucks and the fuel tankers. Secondary explosions rocked the gorge, the sound echoing off the rock walls like continuous thunder. The river below turned black with motor oil and debris. For 4 days, the AVG returned to the gorge again and again. They weren't just destroying equipment, they were breaking the back of an invasion. The Japanese never crossed the Salween River. The Dragon Division was forced to retreat, their momentum shattered. A handful of volunteer pilots had done what entire armies had failed to do. They had saved China. Their victory at the Salween Gorge was the high water mark of the Flying Tigers, but for the men of the AVG, the end was approaching, and it wasn't the heroic finale they'd imagined. On July 4th, 1942, the group was officially inducted into the United States Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group. The Outlaw era was over. Many of the original volunteers, bitter over the way they were treated by the regular Army bureaucracy, refused to re-enlist and headed home. They left behind a record that remained staggering. In just 7 months of combat with never more than 50 fit planes, the Flying Tigers destroyed 296 Japanese aircraft. They lost only 14 pilots in combat, but their legacy isn't just the kill ratios, it's the way they changed the nature of aerial warfare. Claire Chennault's theories, once mocked, became the standard flying doctrine for the U.S. Air Force. This story reminds us that history is often shaped by those who don't fit the mold. The Flying Tigers were misfits, mercenaries, and outlaws. They operated in a shadow war, far from the headlines of Europe or the carrier battles of the Pacific. Yet by their sheer refusal to follow the rules, they held the line when the world was at its darkest point. They showed that a small group of determined individuals equipped with the right tactics and a legendary amount of grit can alter the course of a global war. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.